What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Lost Eidolons, a TRPG or SRPG from Ocean Drive Studios. And as some people may be aware, the day this video is going live is not the day the game is releasing. The game is actually releasing tomorrow. Ocean Drive Studios gave me a review copy with enough time to get this knocked out before the actual release of the game tomorrow. I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube. And while this does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything it entails, and you go to my channel page, if you're not subscribed, the first video you'll see is a video explaining everything. My Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. Now from here, let's actually jump into this title. As I've already mentioned, the game is a TRPG or an SRPG. It is turn-based tactical combat, and it is inspired by Fire Emblem. So if you're familiar with that series of games, you should feel right at home here. And the first thing I want to talk about with Lost Eidolons is actually the difficulty. You have a few different options here: story, normal, and hard, and also a casual or maniac mode. I want to talk about this first because this is not an option you can change later. As of right now, once you pick that difficulty, you're kind of locked into that for the playthrough. Normal provided a pretty good challenge in certain places, and I imagine is what most people will choose, with the primary differences being the damage you take and receive. So on story mode, you receive very little damage, but you'll deal more. Whereas on hard mode, enemies will hit you harder and you will deal less damage. So the thing there is to maximize on the ways to deal the most damage, as you might imagine. And then there are the other two modes, casual or maniac. Casual is kind of the normal game state, whereas maniac is a permadeath option. That said, some of the characters in the game are heavily tied to the plot, meaning that if they fall in combat, you simply won't be able to use them in combat again. They will still, however, appear in cutscenes as well as the camp, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But maniac is, of course, the more difficult permadeath option. Now, before we move on, I do want to mention that because the game is relatively linear, and the fact that you can't change the difficulty mode, and there aren't really a ton of optional battles, shall we say, it's possible to sort of soft lock yourself if you cannot get past a certain point. So you might want to start on the lower things, get used to the game, and then move up to the higher tiers after that. Now, from there, let's talk about the story setup of the title. No spoilers, but just kind of some general information. The game itself takes place across 27 chapters. Each chapter features a bunch of narrative as well as a battle. And then after that battle, once you get to a certain point in the story, you'll retire to your camp for the day, at which point you'll have the opportunity to take part in a few different activities, which we'll talk about in a bit. But that's the general structure to the game as well as the narrative. The setup for the actual plot is that you, a mercenary named Eden, are drawn into a rebellion. There is a waning corrupt empire that took over that's kind of on its last legs, and again, you get drawn into a rebellion against this empire. However, it gets a lot more interesting than that. While that is a decent chunk of the game, things do kind of shift and change about halfway through, which got me immensely more interested, to be honest. The game starts off kind of slow, with a plot that's relatively familiar, and then once you get to a certain point, things get a lot more interesting, and I was pretty invested in the story by the end of it. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is a very cinematic game, if you will, as I'm sure you've probably seen on screen up to this point. There are a lot of cutscenes, there are a lot of animations that are cinematic in quality. However, you can skip all of that, so if you already know what people are going to say or you just don't care, you can just skip it entirely. You don't have to pay attention to it if you don't want to, which I thought was a nice touch because some of the cutscenes are quite lengthy, so especially if you want to do subsequent playthroughs, you can just skip all of that narrative stuff and just get straight to the combat portions. Now, last notes on the story itself. There are a few choices here and there that you can make, but not a ton. For the most part, the narrative is what it is, but you will occasionally have a few choices that can kind of affect rewards and things like that you get, which is mostly tied to the camp system, but the broad narrative remains largely the same. Now, let's actually talk about this camp system I've referred to. As I mentioned, this is where you'll go after the actual battle, and it acts as a sort of hub where you can complete side quests, optional battles, as well as take part in camp activities. Now, for the most part, this more or less is what you would expect it to be. It's a hub where you can do things like sort out your party, get their equipment straightened out, buy and sell items, items, take place in a few narrative things, and every time you go to camp, there are a few required objectives that you have to do before you move on. This is talking to key characters, that type of stuff. And then there are a bunch of optional things, which make up the game's Rapport system, which we're about to talk about. But first, a note on the optional battles. Once you get to a certain chapter, you can start taking part in optional battles in between chapter missions. However, these optional battles are very repetitive. I think I counted about 3 variations. They all have the same map, the same type of enemies, just scaled to your level more or less, which got a bit repetitive on that side, which is a shame because that's really the only non-main story combats that there are. Now, from here, let's talk about this Rapport system. This is essentially an indicator of the bond between you and all of your allies, and the amount of rapport you can gain over the course of the game is limited, meaning that this is a choice you're making to bond with certain characters over others. Now, this is important because building rapport with certain characters will get you certain rewards. Most of the time, the reward is just extra conversations between you and that character, which kind of unfurl their character a little bit. But you can also get occasional rewards like unique side quests that you won't see otherwise. But that brings us to how you actually build rapport. Well, when you're in camp, you are assigned leadership points. As the game progresses and you do more side quests and prestige quests, as they're called, you can increase the amount of leadership you get over the course of the game. But these are effectively your currency to take part in camp activities as well as give gifts, that type of thing. Because how we actually build rapport comes in one of 2 ways: giving characters gifts or participating in activities with them. Gifts are limited. There are a set number throughout the game. The number is fairly high. You can buy a lot of them from a merchant that shows up occasionally, and sometimes you get them as rewards for certain quests. Each character likes different things, so if you give the right character the right gift, you'll get more rapport with that individual character than just giving them all of your gifts per se. Now, the other option to build rapport is to take part in activities. This is only available when that character has a subject they can talk about, which will kind of change and grow as the game progresses, but basically you can spend some leadership points to have a conversation with a character about a certain subject, get their opinion on it, and this will add to their rapport. And as I've already mentioned, all of this leads to unique rewards that you can't get otherwise in some instances via side quests, that type of thing. However, I will say it does feel a little wasted on a few characters because without spoilers, a couple of the characters die throughout the game, which makes a lot of narrative sense, and they do provide you a lot of options for other characters, so I didn't mind per se. But it does kind of make you feel like your investment into building rapport with one of those characters was a bit of a wasted effort. Now from here, let's talk about our actual character progression. It's worth mentioning right here though that there are in the ballpark of 20 to 25, I believe, characters you'll actually be using in combat. I didn't get the exact number, but it's a lot. And each of them is a set character with a story that you'll meet in missions, that type of thing. Some of them are optional, some of them are of course mandatory, but there are other characters that will join your party only if you build up a decent amount of rapport with them when they're visiting your camp. So there are a lot of optional characters that you could also build rapport with and again potentially get unique rewards from. But how do we actually progress all of these characters? Well, this primarily comes down to their equipment and their class. Every character is capable of performing every role, but how good they are at it is determined by their equipment ranks. Equipment ranks are basically their levels, if you will, for the type of equipment that they're using. Be that martial weapons or grimoires for spell abilities, the type of armor they're wearing, that kind of thing. Whenever they use those, they gain ranks in it, which can give them passive and active abilities to use when they use those things. And probably more importantly though, it unlocks your classes. Classes are sort of the big progression thing, as they adjust your stats, give you buffs and abilities, that type of thing, tailored to doing a specific thing. Being a tank, for instance, specializing in a certain type of magic, ranged combat, all of that stuff is dictated by classes mostly, or how good they are at it, I should say. And the requirement for unlocking classes is a character's level combined with ranks in certain types of equipment. Now, overall, the progression here is pretty straightforward. Every character you meet kind of comes with a standard setup, if you will. And then if you play that character like that, they'll progress along their class tree, becoming more and more proficient at that thing. Now, despite the fact that any character can perform any role, there just never really seemed like there was a reason to change them outside of their sort of default one, because you get a variety of characters that are good at a variety of things. So changing a character from one class class to a entirely separate mode of play just never really made much sense. Now, once you get to the bottom tier of classes, or I guess the top tier, depending on how you want to look at it, you actually have a choice that allows you to specialize a little bit farther and become even better in a more specialized role, which is important for higher difficulties where you need to deal a ton of damage to a very specific type of enemy, for reasons we're about to dive into as we come up on the combat section. The combat is very good, if a little bit simple, and probably the most important thing to know up front is that it has a sort of rock, paper, scissors weapons and armor system, meaning that certain types of weapons are good against enemies with a certain type of armor, cloth, leather, or heavy, or plated, and certain weapons deal better damage against certain types of this armor, meaning that having a character that is specialized in certain types of attacks and different kinds of armor is important to attack the enemy with. However, no class is required to use a specific combination. They have a recommendation, of course, like typically mages are going to be using cloth, but there are no real reasons you can't put a mage in, say, plated armor. But from there, let's talk about the rest of the basics of combat. For starters, the animations are really cool. Every time you attack an enemy, there's a sort of animation that plays that kind of makes it look like a battlefield. You can also skip this in the options. You can even set it to auto skip. You can also skip enemy turns entirely, where it'll just fast forward back to your turn, which I think is a nice touch that keeps you in the action. And this being a TRPG, the tactical turn-based combat comes with objectives. One of the primary differences that sets apart a TRPG from, say, a CRPG is the objective-based combat. So the turn-based tactical combat here will occasionally see you just killing everything on the field as a means of winning. However, in many instances, you have a specific goal, like surviving a certain number of turns, killing one specific enemy, just making it to the other side of the map, things like that that are beyond just killing everything. And an important thing to know in that regard is that enemies and you have what is called a zone of control. The 4 adjacent tiles to that character are known as its zone of control. And basically this means that if a character moves into one of those adjacent tiles, they can't go any farther that turn. So this is a way to prevent enemies from running past you, but it's also a way enemies prevent you from running past them. And in missions where, again, your point is to just cross the map, that comes up quite a bit. Some other notes about combat in general, though, that I think are pretty cool are the elemental effects. The battlefield itself does have a little bit of elemental interaction, primarily for mages. For instance, if they use a water spell, this will make the ground wet, which will cause certain debuffs to movement. But then if I were to hit an enemy, say with a thunder spell, while they are drenched, they'll take more damage, and it will also deal damage to any adjacent wet tiles. Hitting a wet enemy with the fire spell will also remove their wet status, for instance. Things like that. It's relatively simple, but it's a nice interaction if you want to play around with it. There are also boss enemies, which I think are important to talk about. Boss enemies work a bit differently from the rest of the enemies in that they take incredibly reduced damage unless they are no longer around any regular enemies. Meaning that if you want to kill a boss, you need to isolate it from its minions, meaning that it has to be a certain distance away from any other regular enemies before it starts taking full damage. This is a thing that comes up a lot and definitely a need to know. And then there are the monster fights. The monster fights are pretty cool, actually. So occasionally you'll be fighting monsters instead of regular enemies. Monsters have a lot more health than regular enemies, but they come with weak points. You see, typically when you hit an enemy, they do a small counterattack for a little bit of damage. In order to prevent monsters from doing this, you can hit them in a weak point. However, what that weak point is changes every turn. And you can see on screen where you have to hit a weak point with a certain type of weapon to effectively deal damage. And then when you destroy all of the weak points, you'll deal a guaranteed critical hit, and hitting the weak points multiple times in a row increases their chain, which deals more and more damage to the monster. So defeating monsters oftentimes comes down to hitting those weak points consistently in order to lock the monster down and not take any damage from it. And last but not least, if all else fails, you have an undo mechanic. A set number of times per combat, you can just roll back the combat to any turn you want to, say, try a different strategy. This is nice because I think it cuts down on the restarting the battle that might otherwise happen. You can just sort of roll back a turn or two if you want, or even all the way back to the beginning to sort of try a different strategy without completely restarting the fight. That's a nice mechanic that I enjoyed a great deal. And that's only the tip of the iceberg for quality of life mechanics. There are other mechanics where you can see the threat range of enemies by pressing F, meaning that that's the tiles they could possibly hit you from. Enemies will also give your characters a sort of telegraph about who they're going to try to attack based on a red line to that character. And because of this, the game feels very fair. Like, it's very clear about what it's going to try to do on every difficulty. And the combat really comes down to mastering that and effectively dealing damage. Now, let's move on to our Steam Deck compatibility. This game plays borderline perfect on Steam Deck. I played it for a few hours across a variety of missions, and the experience is every bit as good as it is on a regular PC, which surprised me, to be honest. But playing this on Steam Deck was actually a great experience. It has controller support, which the recommended layout picks up on and is immediately very good. All of the button prompts are correct. You don't have to adjust any controls, it just works, and I would be surprised if this doesn't get a Great on Deck rating at some point, though currently, with its unreleased state, it is unknown. My only real complaint about playing this game on the Steam Deck specifically was that it was very rough on the Steam Deck's battery. I think I was able to play for like 2.5 hours before the battery went from just about full to almost dead. But nonetheless, honestly, a great experience on that hardware otherwise. But from there, let's move on to positives and negatives and wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, we have the cinematic story and combat. I really like the presentation of the story and the cinematics, the animations and battle. The actual story itself was really cool. Again, I was very invested in that by the end of things. And then, of course, there's the combat itself. Overall, I really enjoyed the systems at play here. I think there's a lot of strategy involved, which is exactly what you want from a game like this. And a lot of the fights themselves are a great length. There's plenty of quality of life options to make it a bit easier to parse through. But the positives here for me were definitely the story itself and the actual combat. Now, in terms of negatives, two really stood out to me, and these are the potential soft locks caused by the difficulty setting options. Again, you can't change them or anything, so even on like normal, if you get to a point or you just messed up in some way, you might very well soft lock yourself because of the very linear nature of the game, which I imagine people are potentially going to find quite frustrating. The other negative side is a lack of variety. You're going to be fighting a lot of the same enemies over and over again. The options battles are again literally the same fight over and over again, just with scaled enemies, and you kind of pretty much know what to expect in terms of enemies variety after you get just a little ways into the game. The late game does throw one or two curveballs at you with a unique enemy, or enemies that behave a little bit differently, but by and large, the game lacks a certain amount of variety, which is probably my biggest complaint overall. And that brings us to our conclusion. Lost Eidolons is going to be available on Steam tomorrow for about $35 US. Overall, I think it's a great entry into the TRPG or SRPG genre. And while it does certainly have a few faults, none of them are what I would consider major, especially for the people that play these types of games. And because of that, if you enjoy this genre at all, I definitely think Lost Eidolons is worth a buy. And I enjoyed it quite a bit, which leaves me curious to see what Ocean Drive Studios does next, because for a first entry, this is a cool game. But that's all I've got for you guys today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this review. Thank you so much for watching and being here. I really do appreciate it. We're growing every day, which is allowing me to get things like pre-release copies for these reviews so they can be up day one or even before, which, as you might imagine, with my particular format of 100% reviews, is a difficult thing to do. So I truly do appreciate that. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.